Hello and welcome to this broadcast by Brexit Watch. I'm your host, Jonathan Saxty. Today we are delighted to welcome Australian statesman and former Deputy Prime Minister John Anderson to Brexit Watch. John Anderson was a member of the Australian House of Representatives between 1989 and 2007. He also served as leader of the National Party, Minister for Primary Industries and Energy, as well as Minister for Transport and Regional Development. Today, he has a thriving channel on YouTube. John Anderson, welcome to Brexit Watch.
Good to be with you, Jonathan. It's a great honour.
The pleasure's all ours. Now, John, before we get into the nuts and bolts of our discussion, I'd like to take this opportunity to wish you and your family well during this unprecedented crisis. Can I begin by asking, I mentioned your thriving YouTube channel, how the coronavirus crisis has personally impacted you and your work over the last few months?
Well, I'm sort of post-political career, have a finger in lots of different pies, not least of all our own family farming operation. My family have been in northwestern New South Wales since the 1830s. My son and daughter-in-law now run our operation. So I've become what we call in Australia the gopher for them. I go for this and I go for that. All of my speaking engagements have either been cancelled for months out, or they're now being done care of Zoom, Skype, Microsoft tools, whatever. And I'm still doing a bit of writing from home. We're now able to move around a little bit again in this country. So for the first time in a long time, we've started up a car and driven to Sydney and back. We're 5 or 6 hours away from Sydney, but it's been quite different. Look, to be really honest, in many ways, I've quite enjoyed it. I've been at home with my family. I've been spending a lot of time outdoors, and it's late autumn here in Australia. Your viewers will note that the sun will go down as we're speaking during this conversation, and I'm in a farmhouse kitchen.
Well, it's a lovely view from this end, I must say. Now, John, you mentioned the situation currently in Australia. Sticking with the crisis, how would you assess the situation on the ground in Australia right now, and how the government there has handled the crisis compared to other governments in the Western world and in the Asia-Pacific region?
Look, I think I would reflect the polls here in Australia. I'd say that there's a feeling that the Commonwealth government, the federal government, has handled it quite well. Australia is a federation. We do have the states. The Prime Minister, I think, wisely not only sought out the best medical advice, put together the best possible medical team, he also set up a thing he calls the National Cabinet, whereby the state premiers, who have a great deal of say in the sort of matters that might relate to a lockdown and so forth in this country. It's a bit of the difference between the UK. We're more like America, where the states have a lot of say over the practical implementation of things like restrictions on movement, interstate movement, those sorts of things. But the National Cabinet, where he's pulled together the whole of the national leadership from the states together with the Commonwealth, sought to ensure they respond to the best possible medical advice and so forth, coupled with some natural advantages and some quite decisive early action. We banned flights from China early on, well before the WTO declared a pandemic. The Prime Minister copped quite a bit of criticism for that. He was even called a racist. But I think in retrospect, it was a good call. It wasn't racist at all, of course, in no way, shape or form. One of the marks of our culture is we bandy these sorts of terms around loosely and in ways that are damaging and silly. But the other thing that Australia has going for it, of course, is space and isolation. And I think that's helped a lot. We watch on as a self-confessed Anglophile with great concern at your experiences in Britain, great concern.
And John, how would you assess the handling of the crisis in Britain and Europe and the United States compared to Australia?
I'd have to say I'm deeply concerned. There's no other way of putting it. And I don't want to sound like I'm a pessimist in this conversation, just the opposite. I think if we can be shaken to the core in terms of reassessing what we value, the need to rebuild trust in our institutions, the need to work together cooperatively, we can come out of this, I think, in better shape, or potentially better shape, certainly better able to handle the challenges before us, which I don't see as new. I actually just see them as a serious acceleration of a whole set of trajectories that we're already facing. But I'm frankly, I'm not at all sanguine. I'm quite concerned about where we're at and what it's going to mean. And even in this country, reforming governments between the mid-80s, when Australia was, in the words of Lee Kuan Yew, the sort of famous statesman from that little place called Singapore, in danger of becoming the poor white trash of Asia. Reforming governments from both sides of politics, right up until the change of government at about the time of the great financial crisis, saw an enormous boost in productivity, in national wealth, in prosperity, and the complete elimination of all public sector debt at a federal level. So even today, this country is ridden on the shoulders of that hard work. It was easy for us to mount, I think I'm right in saying, still the biggest relief package, salvation package, as we put the extraordinary, isn't it? We've put half our economy into hibernation. We've done it knowingly and deliberately. We've shut things down and then we're pumping money into it in the hope to keep the bear fed so that when the season's over, it can come out of hibernation and pick up again. We don't know whether it's not going to be a V-shaped recovery. It may not even be a U-shape. It may be an L-shape. So I think the difficulties are going to be very real. But Australia came out of it, went into it with a still relatively strong fiscal position. Globally, that is not the case, of course, because so few countries were prudent enough to learn the lessons of the GFC and get about the business of budget repair, boosting productivity, reforming their tax systems and so forth. And that's a great concern.
What do you think are going to be some of the major economic and political consequences of this crisis? Obviously, it's a global crisis. It impacts the entire planet. And, even if one country recovers, we hear very good news in this side of the world about the situation in Australia and New Zealand. But of course, if a country's trading partners are all in the tank, then, there's a spillover effect. So what do you see as some of the major political and economic consequences, good and bad, both for Australia and globally?
Well, I think I'd say that the good side potentially is that we've all been shaken up and we will all recognise, let me put it this way, identity politics is a terrible way to try and move forward, or to move forward on the basis of identity politics, where everybody's clamouring to say, I have a grievance, I'm owed, the country's got to look after me. We've got to go back to Kennedy's proposition. All of us have got to ask what we can do for our country, not what our country can do for us. So if we can find some collective willpower again, put aside our differences and our endless focus on things that divide us in Western culture, and start to look on the things that need to unify us as we face enormous challenges, that can be an enormous step forward. But the challenges are going to be immense. So I think what I would say, the greatest challenge of all is restoring the quality of public discourse, which means we have to have respect for one another. We have to let everybody ask their questions, but we have to proceed on the basis of logic and of reason, not emotion. And we have to leave identity politics, grievance politics, victimhood politics so far as possible behind. That's not meant to sound non-compassionate, just the opposite. It's meant to say, or lacking in compassion, it's meant to say that we want to be in a position to look after the disadvantaged or the dispossessed or whatever, but we have to rebuild our economies to do that. A poor place doesn't look after the disadvantaged very well. Now, the debt levels are going to be horrendous. How do we start to manage that? How do you get taxation, the productivity reforms, the trade reforms, the different trading options that are now before us in a world where people will have very deep reservations about globalization and just in time? We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Restricting trade is bad practice. It costs everyone. How do we re-establish a global law-based, if you like, approach to trade? Because it's been, there's a lot of bad things that have happened, despite all the free trade agreements that people have trumpeted in recent years. But then there are other difficult issues. How do we balance privacy and freedom with the understandable desire for people in dangerous times to flee to security and sacrifice some freedoms in the short term? And how do we free ourselves of surveillance of policing and recommit ourselves to the idea that the state should be limited. So they're just some of the challenges that we face, but then there's the whole, what I would call acceleration, I think, of the economic weakening of the West and the rise in the power of an authoritarian state and the dangers that that brings as well. So, the great economic historian Neil Ferguson, man for whom I have an enormous regard, would say that the West's greatest threat in terms of the outlook for its own freedoms and prosperity is its loss of belief in itself and its denial of its history and of its cultural roots. And I think, certainly in this country, what this has reminded us of is that we want to and we need to be able to trust our leaders, that we do value our way of life. And by the way, moral relativism is now under a great big cloud. The truth emerges, we want to know the facts. We want to know what's real and what isn't. We don't actually believe that everybody can have their own view and say, well, I believe this, so it's truth for me. If it doesn't bear scrutiny, if it's nonsense, then I think we are rightly more sceptical now about what I might loosely call moral relativism. So what I'm really saying is there are massive cultural issues that needed to be addressed before this. The lack of prudence in the West that led to the GFC, that then saw us fail in so many countries to do anything serious about redressing the debt crisis that we'd solved with the debt crisis. It was inevitable there was going to be another shock. We will need to be prudent this time, or we will hand to our children and our grandchildren an absolute mess, an intergenerational travesty of justice and fairness.
You mentioned China, and I think it's worth talking at length about that. But before I do, just want to pick up on another thing you said. You mentioned civil liberties. You mentioned surveillance. Do you think there's a risk of civil liberties being impacted negatively over the certainly the medium term because of this crisis?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do, because you see, culturally, we've so decried our own commitment to freedom. It's always been the motleyf of America. In Australia, it's probably more, our motleyf is probably more fairness. But nonetheless, in the West, our traditional commitment to personal freedom and ensuring that governments respond to us and that we elect them and that we remove them, and our loyalties do not lie to them. They are a function of us. We should not allow ourselves to be a function of them. Now, going forward, it's understandable that in the face of a real threat, people have been willing, just as they are in wartime or whatever, to give up some freedoms, to suspend them for a while. But we need to demand them back again. And culturally, I think that may prove a little difficult. See, governments always take more power on themselves in times of emergency. You think of the First World War. It tanked economies. It was such a shock, and governments learnt how to take enormous control. They did the second in the Second World War, if you like, the second stage of the Great War. But we've sort of never really, in this country anyway, surrendered some of the powers that were taken on in wartime. A lot of them have gone. But we don't want to see that situation where there's a ramping up again. And the great problem today is, of course, that so much is known about everyone. It's very easy to control people.
Yes.
So the civil libertarians have got a job to do, but they need to do it perhaps a little more responsibly than they've done it in more recent times. We need those freedoms back again. The West should commit itself to the idea that governments are a function of the people, not the other way around, and leave no doubt that there are limits to how many of these extra powers governments have taken on that should be allowed to remain in place.
Now, you obviously mentioned China in one of your earlier answers. Let's talk about that. What do you think the ramifications are going to be of this crisis for relations between China and the West? Just this morning, just coincidentally, I think I'm right, I think I've got the facts right here. China has slapped a 80% tariff on Australian barley imports in response to, I think I'm right in saying Australia's calls for some kind of inquiry into the crisis. We hear voices here, we hear voices certainly in the United States to hold China to account, that there are questions that need answering. What do you see as the implications for Australian-Chinese relations, but more broadly, relations between China and the whole Western world?
It's a huge question. And I would start by again saying we must believe in our own freedoms and our own values. We've allowed ourselves to become separated from them too much in the West. Freedom matters. It really does. You know, the respect for the individual and so forth. Anyway, I mentioned Lee Kuan Yew. He, way back when I was still Deputy PM, I remember him saying that China would only have to flex its economic muscles to bring people into line, nations and what have you in the future. He said this in about 2000, 2001. And he said the only response will be collective. And I think that is right. So look, I think that the call by our government to insist that there should be a proper inquiry, which is only common sense. It's actually in everyone's interest. We need to know as much as we can about this to avoid a repetition of it. That is everyone's interest, including the Chinese. And initially, you know, it was met with enormous hostility. Now, this comes off the back of our deep concerns about what appears to be a great deal of interference in our political systems, real questions over cybersecurity, and that raises the whole question of how strategic security is secured in the future. We've had political interference on our campuses. We've seen debt diplomacy, if you like, in the Pacific region. These sorts of things have been concerning us. And I think it's important to state that I entirely agree with the Prime Minister when he says we have no argument with the Chinese people at all. We respect them hugely. There's a vast number of them in Australia. But we're a little wary about the way in which Beijing is behaving. And Beijing has changed since Xi became the leader in 2012. It's really important to understand that. We've not changed, but they have. Now, the incredible thing is, of course, that so many countries, including Britain, have stepped up, joined Australia, and now President Xi has announced that China will support an inquiry and indeed is committed financially to it. Those are welcome straws in the wind. I would be keen to say that we should always seek to talk politely. We should, even when, you know, in the game of giving and taking offence, never works to take offence. You've got to maintain diplomacy, decency, politeness, put your case firmly, seek to understand and to be understood. I believe in those things very, very deeply. And we always need to remember that China felt humiliated by what happened in the 19th century. And they don't want to go back there. But there are better ways to seek global cooperation than what we've seen. Now, there's another aspect of this that must not be forgotten that emerges out of it, and that's the security of our supply chains. I mean, I think the reality is very hard to avoid the observation that the idea of the sort of made in China by 2025 or whatever it was of some 10 major lines of manufacturers and what have you in China really amounted to an attempt to seek monopoly control over the supply of a range of things around the world. Well, we've had a massive wake-up call. Dependent, for example, for pharmaceuticals out of China, for face masks, respiratory equipment. But it's more than that in this country. Australia is a major agricultural producer. I'm one of them, play a small part in it. And our food chain's been very secure. I think I'm right in saying no country exports a higher proportion of its agricultural produce than Australia, because there's only 26 million of us. Big land area, although a lot of it's desert. One Australian farmer feeds 600 others. That's a staggering statistic. And you would think on the face of it, well, our food supplies are absolutely secure. In fact, like everything else, there's a global supply chain involved. We are dependent on imported fuel, imported fertilisers, because gas and energy prices in Australia have been allowed to escalate too much. It's cheaper to bring it in than to make it here. And certain key chemicals that we need to keep our agricultural production levels so high and so our sector so efficient depend upon imported products. So this whole issue of the security of supply lines will be a major one going forward. And again, I mean, I would say to the Chinese, with the greatest of respect, we will all lose if we don't find ways to ensure that we all abide by a decent set of rules. A rules-based trading global environment is really important for every one of us. No one wins. History is quite clear on this. When we compromise, when we crimp standards and decency in trade. Now, we all know that everybody tries to tease the edges of trade. We know that, but all the more reason for a rules-based system. And, you know, as one who's had quite a bit of involvement in my public life in agricultural trade reform, Britain, you know, has a very proud record in seeking better ways forward as a member of the EU in that regard. I remember being in the OECD headquarters in Paris, and Australia, along with many other countries, was arguing for serious agricultural trade reform. And there was terrific support from the British.
It's a lot to unpack. Like you said, it's a big question, and you gave a great answer there, John, so thank you. And there's a lot to unpack. One thing I picked up on, in terms of Australia, do you think Australia, but also the West, has become almost too dependent on China economically?
Well, Australia, no country runs a bigger surplus with China than Australia because of our iron ore and our coal.
Yeah.
Now we have this problem of 4 meatworks being told they can't export meat to China, and the barley tariffs, and we will seek to work through those as best we can, but we have to do it in a way that doesn't sacrifice our values. I remember something Kissinger said to the effect of, a little trade lost can almost always be recovered, but freedom lost may never be recovered. And so you can't sacrifice your values. You must stand by what you believe in. Now, having said that, you know, I don't pretend the way forward is going to be easy, which is why I say that we have to look to our self-belief, and without, you know, resorting to hubris, without beating our chests unwisely. One of the great changes over my lifetime that I've noticed in this country is that somewhere along the way, there was always this emphasis in Australia. My father was always drilling it into me. He was a great sportsman. He played rugby in England in 1936 on what we'd now call a gap year. It's a long time ago. They played 9 games in England, and I hate to say it, they won every one. And you know, the first game had got quite a bit of coverage in the papers. As each game went, it was dispatched in the favour of the Australians. The column inches in the English papers were shorter. Sorry, forgive me for being cheeky. But you know, I think the point is that I've lost my thread of thinking here now. But we really do have to think carefully about how we move forward now. We've got to, without... I was making the point that humility, and our greatest cricketer, Donald Bradman, was known for, you know, modesty in victory and graciousness in defeat. It was a terrible thing to use a vernacular to be on yourself, but somewhere we've switched over the last 50 years in the West from the idea of celebrating the virtue of humility and modesty and a sense of proportion for pride. And pride always comes before a fall. We need to re-find our cultural roots. I can't emphasize that enough. It'll be the key to us ensuring that we work together cooperatively and collaboratively and politely and firmly, even when we disagree.
I wonder if the crisis could accelerate a lot of trends. I mean, around the world, I'm sure it's the same in Australia, people have been working from home, and there have been a lot of people saying here, a lot of commentators and businesses saying that, you know, perhaps this has just accelerated a trend and there can be more home working from here on in. That would obviously have huge ramifications for infrastructure, for where people live, even for commuting and automobile sales. I've also heard people suggest that this crisis could accelerate technology, which led to more automation in industry. We touched on China and supply chains. I think one American official has made the point, perhaps in the future, this crisis could accelerate, whether it's 3D printing or robotics, it could accelerate more, it could bring industry back to the Western world. What do you think of the idea of this crisis having some good implications economically as well?
Oh, I think it will. I do believe that. I preface my remarks by saying I'm worried that it will be lumpy and uneven, and many good people will be left behind.
Right.
Many people will find they're competing with older people who are out of a job and they've had some experience and so forth. And so young people find it harder to get in, as we know. The failed response, and I do call it a failed response to the GFC, with the attempts to make money so freely available, has pumped up asset prices while you've had flatlining real wages. Young people now feeling they can't get into assets, mainly houses, particularly sensitive issue in Australia. If we're not careful, we'll exacerbate that trend. And I have 4 kids in their late 20s, early 30s, and grandkids now. I know I'm really concerned. I'm a mid-baby boomer, and I've been very, very fortunate, and so have my generation in many ways, in accumulating some, prosperity and comfort. I hate the idea that we couldn't provide the same opportunities for those generations that are following in our footsteps. That would be, if you like, what did Edmund Burke say? Life is a contract between the dead, the living, and the future. And I think of the sacrifices of people like my father, who was involved in Monty's great big push against Rommel and nearly lost his life. He was expected to live in the Egyptian desert in 1942. We've got a responsibility to think about next generations. But having said that, plainly, we will learn a lot about how to use modern technology very effectively. I think it will bring jobs back to the West, particularly in the service sector. We probably will become more efficient too, I think, at manufacturers. I suspect that we'll get used to not using our cars, a simple example, quite as much. I wouldn't like to be an automaker at the moment. I wouldn't like to be an airline operator either.
No, I agree.
I think those sectors, many sectors, will be very slow to recover. But having said that, since time immemorial, we've worried about jobs being displaced by technology. In reality, as long as you've not been a Luddite or a troglodyte and stood in the way of it, ultimately, new and better jobs have emerged with more leisure time and more prosperity. If we do this properly, there's no reason why the sort of, if you like, the sort of classical economic reality should be somehow terminated or not continue as reality.
How do you think we get around, you mentioned, that the lumpy, almost a lumpy recovery, and there might be some intergenerational issues. How do we mitigate the intergenerational conflict, and how do we mitigate the effects of those people who are sort of left by the wayside, left in the wreckage of this crisis, made redundant, etc.?
I don't have any glib answers. Any attempt to give sort of smart answers would be glib, because all I can do is say that I think they're going to be huge issues. That in terms of, in this country anyway, taxation reform, it'll have to be carefully designed to try and encourage growth, to try and encourage younger people starting out. I do think we could probably focus a bit more on the quality of our universities. My personal view is that in this country, well, I'll be frank, I think it probably applies to virtually every Western country except Japan. We've overemphasised pumping everybody through universities. They've become sausage makers, and a lot of the product hasn't been very good. I don't mean the kids coming out of university, I mean what they've been given. And we've undercooked vocational training. And if you look at Japan, now I know there's demographic reasons, and they're very good at manufacturers and so forth. But if you look at the way that they've done vocational education, the number of people who have done vocational education and gone out into the workforce and are employed is extraordinarily high by Western standards, and their remuneration is very high. So good policy here, and the willingness to think outside the square. And I think in part what I'm saying here is that this sort of overemphasis on, saying, if you really want to be a valued member of the community, you've got to have a university degree. We need to rethink some of that stuff, I think.
And just before we move off the coronavirus, what's been your reaction to the American rhetoric with regard to the World Health Organization? Do you agree with what President Trump has said?
Look, I do think it has some merit. It's in the nature of things, isn't it? Everything we touch, every body, every institution we set up, every so often needs a major clean-up. Look, I think there are some real questions to be asked there. They were far too slow in declaring a pandemic. It's really very interesting to contemplate that there was a major annual, the World Economic Forum in Davos, the 21st to the 24th of January. There were even representatives from Wuhan province in China there. Now, all they talked about really was climate change. And yet you would have thought the world's leading economic thinkers, private and government sector, would have recognised the train coming down through the tunnel that was about to smash everything, and it was an immediate and present danger. So, you know, this ability to sort of walk and chew gum and to recognise you've got to be active on many fronts at one time is something we need to recover. Let's call it prudence, one of the classic virtues. There's a great deal to be said for prudence. People think, oh, well, is prudence an old lady calling to us not to do that dear or not to do this dear? No, 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 no. Prudence is carefully assembling all of the information you can, thinking it through carefully, seeking to be wise, and then making good decisions about what to do for positive outcomes, not cautiously saying we won't do this for fear of, but how do we do the best possible thing going forward? We will need a recovery of prudence going forward.
Now, leaving coronavirus for the moment, John, let's talk about, this is obviously Brexit Watch, so we need to talk about Brexit. As a self-confessed Anglophile, as an Australian, as a fellow subject of Her Majesty, what has been your assessment of Brexit as a phenomena and your assessment of the European Union as an institution over the last decade or so?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question. And look, can I just say at the outset, the last thing I want to do is a mere Antipodean. I know we share a monarch and what have you, and many cultural institutions, but I should be very wary. And I have a lot of friends in England who are very divided, and family divided on this issue. But look, I think where I would start is to say that I haven't lost faith in the idea of a nation state. I've always believed that, you know, we give our loyalties to one another, and that can be a good thing, provided that we, if you like, obey the golden rule: do unto others as you'd have them do unto yourself. There's a nationalism that isn't evil or horrible or ugly. And I've always been wary of this European idea that somehow or other you've got to do away with borders to prevent conflict and disagreement and potentially nastier things in the future. I've been unconvinced. I'm particularly unimpressed with the idea of a common currency. It seems to me that what you've done is remove one of the most benign, smooth working, kindest and compassionate and effective stabilisers, if you like, when an economy gets into a little bit of difficulty. So the euro, I know Britain stayed out of it, but I look at the way in which it's advantaged German exports. And we know they're fiscally prudent, to use that word again, but they've had an enormous leg up. Because if it was still the Deutschmark, their exports would be much more highly priced in places like Australia, but it holds back the southern European countries, which are quite different. And that word different, what's wrong with being different? Why do we all want to be the same? I mean, when I go to Europe, I find each country quite fascinating, and I want them to be different. Doesn't mean they can't all get on. We all need to get on, particularly if we love freedom and we believe in democracy. But why surrender sovereignty, to a common currency and to a borderless society and to technocrats in Brussels? Because when the chips are down, I think my case has been really rather made by COVID. Even in Italy, where people have been sceptical about their governments for, since the end of the Second World War, if not a lot longer, who did they look to in the COVID emergency that hit them? They didn't look to the WTO. They didn't look to Brussels. They looked to Rome.
Yeah.
I think I can understand why so many Britons had such deep reservations about transferring accountability from their own parliament and their own elected representatives to technocrats in Brussels. Now, they might be elected, but we all know how it really works. And I mean, in the whole area of human rights, for example, the clash of human rights, technocrats deciding what we can and can't do. I just think the older British model of, the common law and the commitment to freedom and treating one another decently and what have you is a preferable model. So that's maybe an unusual way of coming at it. But my guess is that if people stopped and thought carefully about COVID and what it's shown us about who we really look to, and who we want to be able to trust and to lead us in difficult times, in the democracies, it's our own national parliaments and the people we put there and the people we want to be able to quietly remove it with the point of a pencil rather than a gun if they don't get it right. And I do think that Britain, if I can say this, you've still got a lot to offer the world. I mean, it's still a remarkable country. And I just believe that handled the right way, Britain will have terrific relationships with most of its European neighbours. It'll still be highly influential in European and global affairs. And I think that's a good thing. And I don't believe it's compromised. I actually believe it can be built up if this is handled in a sensible way going forward.
It's interesting you say that, John. I mean, right now the UK is in a transition period with the EU. Brexit happened earlier this year, and as things stand, the transition period continues until the end of the year. And during that transition, as you probably know, the UK remains in the single market and the customs union. It no longer has any MEPs. It's a bit like taxation without representation, which is why people want it to be done and dusted fairly fast. It's there as a sort of as a transition period to sort of enable a new deal to be worked through. On our side, David Frost; on the EU side, led by Michel Barnier. The reports we hear in the press here is that the talks there have been problems, there have been a lot of disagreements, and there are calls increasingly, both in the EU and in the UK. The Scottish National Party have lent their voices to such calls to extend the transition period, to push the transition period back into 2021. The thinking is, well, it's all shoulders to the wheel with coronavirus. All resources are committed there. So we don't really have the resources and the time to get a deal. And we need to kind of, push the transition period back. Who knows when, 2021, but, likely, but maybe even longer. What would you say to that? What would you say to those people who say we should push the transition period for Brexit back?
Well, I think I would say a little bit of interview. Jonathan, I think what I would say is that it'd be a good idea to have a look at their motivation. If their motivation is really to stall, to put off, to reinvent, to water down, to somehow or other continue the fight against the clear decision of the British people, I think that's profoundly anti-democratic. I think the people have spoken very clearly, and I don't think a democracy works if you ignore the people's voice. That's it in a nutshell. It must be delivered. Now, it's not for me, from this side of the world, to say, look, there can't be any extension of time in a COVID world. But I think I'd be wanting to look closely at the motivation, the real motivation of people looking for a delay. Some will be genuine, some will have agendas, and I would be saying, don't compromise democracy anymore. We have entered a time, I'm speaking here of Australia, where you've seen a resurgence of trust in leadership and in government instrumentalities and public institutions, helped in this country because we've done reasonably well. I think I can say that. At least this time, who knows? Remember, we're going into our winter. Yeah. And we know the virus doesn't like warmer climes. So I'm not wanting to be smug and say that we can show the world how to do it. All I can say is that at this stage, the Australian people feel it's been well handled. There's been a resurgence of trust. The breakdown of trust in our institutions in the West has threatened us all. Well, Brexit now is about trust because the British people have clearly spoken. I mean, I don't see how anyone can deny that. And to be anti-democratic, to sniff down your nose, as so many in certain circles, amongst the anywheres, if you like, at the somewheres, well, I think we've seen around the world now that people actually like a place to belong to. I suspect the somewheres now are feeling somewhat vindicated. To break their trust now I think would be a very dangerous thing to do, frankly.
John, what do you see as the opportunities, economic opportunities particularly, for the UK going forward regarding Australia and possibly the other Commonwealth countries? You'll be aware of the CANZUK idea, the idea that Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom should have stronger ties. How that shapes up is up for discussion, whether it's some kind of movement agreement, whether it's increased geopolitical ties, defense, economic. But the idea these countries share not just a head of state, commander-in-chief, but as you mentioned, language, Quebec aside, culture, political system, common law, etc. What do you see as the potential for CANZUK, the potential for renewed economic relations between Australia and the UK after Brexit?
Well, in the broad, a little bit of breakup there. I'm sure our editors can edit that out. In the broadest terms, it can only be a good thing because, you know, the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama, I think, wrote of it, and after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, it hasn't turned out that way. In fact, it turns out that the democracies, the sort of capitalist democracies that looked as though they'd carried the day, are now not doing so well, and democracies in retreat. The unipolar sort of world, led by the Americans, is looking shakier. There are many heads of power. The world is a dangerous place. We now know not just about, guns and planes and ships and what have you. It's all about cybersecurity and who controls the flow of information, the massive amounts of data that are out there. Really quite frightening for us all. The capacity to surveil what everyone's doing. This is a very, very different world to live in. Now, anything that builds alliances and, if you like, really deep understanding between people who are still committed to democratic freedoms and prosperity and just and fair societies, and societies where the individual can be nourished and flourish, if you like, that has to be a good thing. And plainly, we have a great deal in common. Not to say there aren't differences. There was certainly some angst in agricultural circles in Australia when Britain joined the EU, and somehow or other New Zealand managed to keep exporting to Great Britain and we didn't. So we had a major trade shock when Britain didn't want our product. Here we are now facing some problems with China and access there, but we went through this with Britain and it created a lot of angst. Nonetheless, the cultural ties that we have, they're immense. It's a while ago now, but I remember, these are only very broad numbers, but your High Commissioner to Australia some years ago gave a fascinating speech in Canberra, and he pointed out that in about 1960, I think it was, some 50 or 60,000 Australians went to Britain every year, and about 30,000 Britons came out here. But by about 2000, it was about 800,000 or 900,000 going each way. The cultural ties between Britain and Australia are still extraordinarily deep, and I'll say that even as somebody of Scottish heritage. And look, I'm all for building on that. I'm all for building it for security reasons, for prosperity reasons, for, if you like, rebuilding our confidence in our own culture. I don't say for a moment it was ever perfect, but what we've had going for us is the capacity, I think, and the freedom to address the areas where we've not been doing as well, where we've been unfair, where we've not treated people well. But we've allowed that to drift now under this terrible fragmentation, this tribalisation I touched on earlier, that might be called identity politics, where we all are encouraged to believe we have grievances, real or imagined. And of course there are people who have grievances. But the way to deal with it is not, in my view, by demanding that the rest of the country or the rest of our culture come to heel to address my grievances. The far better way, by the way, is to drop this narcissistic obsession with self, and for all of us to be consciously looking around saying, well, who needs the helping hand? Who are we still leaving behind? And a little less narcissism and a lot more neighbourliness might be something that comes out of this whole pandemic in the West. I hope it does. And if Canada and Australia and New Zealand and Britain, with so much in common, and let's bell the cat. America, not so confident on the global stage for various reasons today. Maybe we can do something to really build a sense of fellowship and vitality and neighbourly, sort of strong neighbourly ties.
I second all of that, John. I mean, there are some people who are listening to us talking who would say that it would be foolish for Britain to turn its back on this huge market on its doorstep. I would say that Brexit isn't turning its back on, but some people characterise it that way, turning its back on this market on its doorstep, and increased trade ties with Canada and Australia and New Zealand, aside from the rest of the world, could never compensate for any loss that Britain would suffer from reduced ties or increased tariffs with Europe. What would you say to that?
I'd say it's never. I'd say for a start, we'll just see if we can get that sound sorted. I think my initial response would be to say, don't try and be too binary on this. You just sound strident. The reality is that we're all self-interested. The Europeans aren't going to give up a good deal if Britain can offer one. Why would they? That would be silly. And it would also be churlish. You don't give up on a member of the family who decides they want to go and live somewhere else. You just find different ways to cooperate because it's in everybody's interest to do so. Now, I'm all for increasing trade opportunities between Australia and Great Britain and the other members of that foursome. The only comment I'd make is we've got to be realistic about it. Staggeringly to me as a farmer, I think it's true to say that at the end of the First World War, the British were only about a third self-sufficient in food. That little island, which by the way is about the same size of the rural electorate that I represented in the federal parliament in Australia for 19 years, is now 2/3 sufficient in foodstuffs. It's an astonishing performance. So as a major agricultural exporter, I'm sure, our wines, and I could be very cheeky and refer to a Britain I know that's gone, but you need our superior quality lamb and beef because your cooking's pretty ordinary. But I can't say that anymore because I know there's been a revolution on the culinary front in Britain over the last 20 years. But hopefully you can still be interested in our agricultural products. And then, there are some certain niche areas where we're very strong in manufactured medical equipment. So let's explore the opportunities. Let's maximise them. Everybody gains. But I just can't see the Europeans, and this is not a critical comment, being so short-sighted as to cut off their nose to spite their face. Why would they? Why would anyone do that? We know the price of restricting trade. We've learned that lesson many times through history. Everyone loses.
Just one final question, John, on Brexit and the EU. You mentioned earlier the COVID had sort of showcased some of the divisions in the EU. There have been budgetary turmoil in the Eurozone earlier this year, disputes over the budget. Obviously, there have been divisions in the Eurozone recently over so-called Corona bonds, so-called common debt issuance, something the hard-hit Italians and Spaniards, the Italian and Spanish governments want, and the North European countries, often characterised as more fiscally prudent. The German government, the Austrian government, the Dutch government have said, they don't want this. Now there seems to be a little bit easing of this division. Taking that into account and looking forward, what do you see as potentially the future? What does the future look like, do you think, for the European Union?
Again, I'm cautious because I don't really know. My guess is that the sort of populist movements that you saw after the GFC may very well give way to green movements. And it may very well be that if Europe's not careful, you'll get a major split there between Eastern Europe and Western Europe for a start. Because the Eastern European countries will still be keen to advance their economies and their living standards. The Western economies, cultures may very well think, no, saving the planet is, what life's all about. And if they're not careful, I actually think there's a great danger that for political reasons, they will deindustrialise but not decarbonise their economies.
Right.
And I think that's a great division coming up. And in the name of deindustrialising and hoping to decarbonise, you may see, you could well see a surge in protectionism, and if they can afford it, find somebody to print the money for them, even higher government indebtedness as they try to move their economies. And so I'm not optimistic about them really finding the way forward financially. I think it looks quite troubling from an outsider's perspective. And to be honest, it's part of the reason why I think if I were Britain, I'd be saying, I'm not sure I want to be shackled to some of that stuff. Now, having said that, my guess is that Britain will remain very influential in Europe anyway. How could it not? Even though it may not be formally part of the EU.
John, tying everything together, we've discussed coronavirus, Brexit, the EU, China too. If you had one big prediction for the world, perhaps for Australia, either on the economic or political front, over the rest of the year, the next the sort of short to medium term, what would that big prediction be if you had one?
That the term will be here quite a while. The world is going to become an even more dangerous place, economically, socially, and even strategically, which will mean an even greater need for clear, calm leadership supported by a commitment to the Commonwealth and a resurgence, underpinned by a resurgence in prudence and concern for others. And the good sign, the best thing we can say is that there has been a resurgence of those qualities, I think, of people recognising we need to pull together. But when we do start to move into recovery, and when we do have to start to make very tough decisions about the fact that we just simply can't afford to go on printing money forever and so forth, you can't go on building up debt forever. We can't suspend the rules forever. That's when our patience and our solidarity will be really tested. We need to recognise we're not very good at history anymore, but we stand on the shoulders of giants. You think of the times that Britain, under immense pressure, has shown steely determination to, if you like, preserve all that is good. Well, that's what we need to see a resurgence of, and let's hope and pray that that happens.
Well, on that note of hope, John, I think that's probably a good place to end. So thank you for your time today. Really appreciated it.
Thanks. I've enjoyed being with it, with you, and I look forward to the day when I can visit Britain again personally. My wife and I both have connections there still. I mean, I don't think I've ever been to Britain and not marvelled at the beauty of the place and the history, and there's a winsomeness about the Brits at their best that's very appealing. So look forward to closer connections, whether it's trade and strategic and cultural, or whether it's visiting one another's countries in the future.
You're certainly very, very welcome, John. So my thanks to John Anderson today, and thank you for watching. If you'd like to find out more, go to www.brexit-watch.org. You can also find us on Twitter and on Facebook. Until next time.